Just look at it. I've been saying, the AGM, we've had a lot of talk about what's going to happen on the two strikes. Now, we've talked in the past and said, it's not going to affect, given the few companies that are affected. It was pretty amazing that in the first week, a company gets a strike against them.
I think we've talked about the two strikes being meaningless in terms of what will happen if there are two strikes. But the one, I guess if there is a positive to the two strikes rules, it does garner greater media attention on the bad remuneration policies that are out there. And it is usually the same old suspects that come up year after year, and the same shareholders from those companies that do vote against the remuneration reports, and GUD obviously being the first cab off the rank.
Well, tell me a bit about GUD. Did they deserve this? Have they not learnt lessons from the past? Did they not read the newspapers and see what was the mood out there?
The thing about remuneration reports and getting them through is actually pretty easy to get a remuneration report passed. It's a matter of just consulting with your main shareholders and just checking with them what they think of the practices. It's not that difficult. If you look at what GUD have done this year, they had about, I think it was a 43% against vote. And the main issue shareholders had was, if you look at pretty much every metric, EPS, earnings per share was down, net profit was down, share price was down, so everything was down, except for there was one measure of profit that wasn't down. But despite that, Ian Campbell, the CEO, got a pay rise from 1.6 to 2.3 million in total, and his fixed pay was up from 880,000 to about 1.5. So it was a pretty substantial pay rise. And just I had to look a bit more closely at the remuneration report. And the one thing that really caught my eye, and that most people probably would have missed, was the way the long-term incentive is structured. And long-term incentive is, there's basically three parts to every CEO's pay. There's fixed pay, which is the base salary. There's short-term incentives, which is pretty much at the whim of the directors. And there's long-term incentives. And usually the long-term incentive is actually quite well structured, and most companies have usually two hurdles. For example, an earnings per share hurdle and a total shareholder return hurdle. And they're usually benchmarked against competitors. What GUD have done is they've done that long-term incentive and purely a total shareholder return compared to the competitors. But to get paid 100% of the incentive, they simply have to perform at the median level. So if GUD performs at an average level, the CEO is paid his full 100% bonus, and even worse, it's paid in cash. So if suddenly the performance turns bad in a year or two down the track, suddenly there's no recompense for shareholders there.
Okay.
That the CED's got his cash.
Two questions on the GUD. Firstly, I go back to what I said originally. I mean, do they just have a tin ear? Is it worth a try on? I mean, how do you get to a point you have even a first strike at this point, do you think, in this case?
Well, if you think about it, for an executive who obviously, the pay is not set by the executives, but they're going to push for as much pay as they can get. And for a remuneration committee or chairman, there's no real backlash on them, even if they do get a strike. Why do they care?
Okay,
I think
so that brings me to the second question. Will they learn their lesson? Because they don't want a second strike, do they?
Well, even if they do get a second strike, sure, the ball gets spilt, but the directors aren't going to get voted off. I think if you have a look at the great quote from Clive Hall, I've got it here, who's the chairman, he said something like, "We're not an ANZ, we're not a BHP, we're not talking about millions and millions of dollars here." But if you look at it, the net profit of GUD was 39 million. They paid the CEO 2.3 million.
I was going to say, it's all relative, isn't it?
That's 5%. I think if Marius Kloppers was paid the same percentage of net profit, he'd be at 1.1 billion. So
you'd worry about the mathematics of this chairman, wouldn't you? His numbers, if he couldn't see that.
I think you worry a lot about the chairman in this case. But ultimately, I think when I was on here last, we had this discussion, and you said, "Oh, what about two strikes?" I said, "Well, if you want to solve remuneration problems, there's a much easier way to do it. Just don't pay the chairman if your remuneration gets voted down. I can guarantee there won't be one remuneration report getting voted down."
I like that, but we've got chairmans adding on extras for extra meetings. I mean, they've got their snouts in the trough as well. Just give us a bit of an idea.
Just on that, it's interesting, if you look at what the chairman of GUD was paid, he got $241,000 last year for not in a very large company to attend 10 meetings. So it's about $24,000 a meeting. So pretty handy to learn.
Did he do what that other chairman did and then double it by adding on a few meetings?
I don't think he doubled it this year, but it's certainly pretty handy little earner.
Okay, just a quick one before we get to something else I want to ask you about. Who do you think, what are the companies you think are going to be vulnerable this year?
I think there's a fair bit of talk on Foster's, and it's a bit of a Pyrrhic sort of vote here, obviously with SAB Miller taking them over. But if you look at the payout that John Pollars is getting, what the Foster's board has done, led by David Crawford, ironically a critic of remuneration of proxy advisors, the Foster's board have basically said, well, thanks, John, you've worked here for 4 months as CEO, you can have 520,000 options vesting in Foster's. So that's about a $5 million payout to Pollars for being CEO since April. And basically what Foster said is if this isn't approved by shareholders, we're going to pay him in cash anyway. So effectively held a gun to the heads of shareholders, and that's an appalling payout. No disrespect to Pollars, he's done nothing wrong. He's the one being paid, but the Foster's board. Abhorrent payment, and obviously it's being paid by SAB Miller, you could say.
Especially
so,
as you say, with David Crawford speaking out with Don Argus against it, it's just beyond comprehension, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course Crawford getting paid about $490,000 himself, and as we know, Crawford was on the Foster's board when they approved the Southcorp takeover, and we know how well that's gone.
Yes, and again, just quickly, what was the other one you mentioned? I think you said Toll, which is already...
Toll's an interesting one. Toll's a company that has a great run. Paul Little was such a fantastic CEO, and unfortunately that the run sort of came to an end around just before the GFC, and the Asciano split off, and it was actually featured in my book Pigs at the Trough, but there was a bit of a controversy back in 2008 when Toll decided to pay out some options to Little, valuing those options at $25, when effectively $25 a share when Toll was trading at half of that. Toll's now at about $4.95 a share or something. So you got about a $4 million payout that wasn't really warranted at all. And now, about to give his swan song, Little's been paid a $1.25 million termination payment, a $250,000 non-compete payment, and a $1.5 million year consultancy agreement, which is most bizarre.
We'll catch up on Toll and find out what happens in that. But I wanted to end on a positive note on all this. There was good news today. The old risk metrics team that was brought out, Dean Push, Martin Lawrence, they've set up a new one called Ownership Matters, and that'll put a bit of a fear into some of the companies, and they'll get into this. I know you agree with me that they were a great loss to the corporate governance sphere, weren't they? And now they're back, which is good.
But they certainly were. I saw that the email from Dean today, and fantastic news for shareholders and for media commentators alike, because I know Dean's been working at I think AXI this year, but Martin's had a bit of time off, and Simon as well. So to have the corporate governance dream team back together again, I think that's great news for shareholders.
So it's not just good news for financial shows like mine, that we've got people who'll actually speak and make sense and whatever on this and are prepared to speak out, but good for shareholders to have people of that calibre, isn't it?
Well, if you look at some of the great research they did when they were Risk Metrics and ISS before that, it was really Dean and Martin who exposed the Macquarie and Babcock model as being a fallacy. They were the only ones that talked about the Allco Rubicon disaster that basically destroyed Allco and netted David Coe and Gordon Fell about 25 million and 13 million respectively. So they were absolute leading light in not simply advising shareholders how to vote, but doing much deeper research on corporate governance matters as well, and it's great to see them back. And obviously ISS now part of MSCI will still go on from Sydney, and
they will, and they wouldn't speak to the media, so it deserves it. We won't give them a plug. We'll go all for the new guys. I'm going to have to wrap there. Thank you very much, Adam Schwab from Melbourne. We'll talk to you soon.